Oh, orchids. Orchids are beloved for their striking flowers that are beautifully arranged at the end of a long green stem. Their flowers can be up to 6 inches wide, and they bloom in the most elegant of clusters. Some varieties are also fragrant, which just adds to their elegance. We're talking about moth orchids today because those are the most common orchids found in nurseries and stores. And more than likely, if you're in Florida, the moth orchid is the one you'll see quite often due to their beautiful presentation and ease of care. There are other varieties of orchids that can do well here in Florida also, but they do require a little extra attention. However, it'll be worth it when you spot those jealous neighbors trying to get a closer peek at your orchids. Some of those varieties include the Cattleya, which has large, colorful flowers, and it's actually fragrant. They have a buttery vanilla smell similar to a moonflower. Then there's the Dendrobium, which has more of a cane-shaped stem, and they're usually a little more compact, so it looks like it's just overcrowded with flowers, which is actually really nice. Then there's the Vanda, which has a very unique and visually striking appearance with this beautiful cluster of flowers at the top. The foliage grows in a unique pattern that looks like a shape of a feather. You'll usually see these just hanging about with their roots kind of drifting in the wind. You'll likely need to water or mist these daily, unless they're in a humid area, so be prepared to cater to a diva. Then we have the Oncidium, which produces clusters of small, delicate flowers that come in a variety of colors. This variety can tolerate a bit more light, so these would be considered medium light, while the moth orchid would be more of a low light orchid. Oncidium are great for creating little mini orchid displays. We've had a few of these pop up in some old orchid baskets. We don't know why, we don't know where they came from, but we're not really complaining either. And finally, we have the Epidendrum. This orchid can bloom multiple times a year, producing clusters of small, colorful flowers. So this is a cool one to keep around also. As for our moth orchids, they're native to Southeast Asia, including areas such as the Philippines, Taiwan, and even Northern Australia. They typically grow in climates that are warm and humid, so their native habitats can be mimicked fairly easily here in Florida. South Florida definitely has the humidity part covered. The expert word for the moth orchid is this word. I just think about the wrong word entirely, so we'll just leave that one for the experts to fling around. I do know, however, that they are also epiphytes, which means they can grow on other plants without harming the other plant. Orchids, bromeliads, and air plants don't cause any harm to the trees they attach themselves to. They latch on and anchor themselves to the surface, and then produce air roots to absorb moisture from the air. I believe some varieties are able to absorb moisture through their leaves. I'll have to triple check that information before the experts come and take my orchids away from me. They're very picky about this stuff. The orchid's roots can trap falling debris, so it can obtain nutrients from organic matter also. This can be leaves, pieces of tree bark, or even dead insects. It's like it creates its own little private compost beneath its roots. It's an ideal placement if you ask me. Some orchids can be very difficult to grow and maintain, but when you see the results of your loyalty, you'll be in complete awe. There are orchid experts here in the United States who have some amazing orchid displays you should check out. Try looking up the largest orchid collections. Also, look up Singapore's National Orchid Garden. You won't be disappointed. So, how do we care for our orchids so we can make the neighbors jealous? Well, orchids are top tier when it comes to floral warfare, so let's get a few things in order to ensure the neighbors just can't stand seeing your orchids from across the street. Don't you like the way that sounds? When it comes to orchids, we really have to pay attention to some general care information, which includes lighting, watering, temperature, humidity, potting medium, and fertilization. As for lighting, moth orchids love bright, indirect light. Direct sunlight can scorch their leaves, so you'll want to place your orchids near an east or west facing window. If it feels like there's still too much sunlight making contact with your orchids, try using a sheer curtain to filter the sunlight. For watering, you'll want to water your orchids when the potting medium feels dry to the touch. This should be about once a week. Ensure your orchid pots have good drainage to prevent root rot. You can find or even make pots that have holes all around the pot. This ensures drainage and airflow for the roots inside of the pot. It's widely recommended that you water your orchids in the mornings, as this allows the orchids to dry for the remainder of the day. As for temperature, these orchids prefer temperatures between 70 and 85 degrees during the day, and temperatures between 60 and 70 degrees during the evenings. Definitely sounds like Florida to me. Orchids are quite sensitive to cold weather and prefer to stay in warm environments. For you snowbirds, not only will you need to bring them indoors if they're outside, but you'll need to keep them in an area that will stay relatively warm while indoors. As for humidity levels should be between 50 and 70%. If the air is too dry, use a room humidifier to help increase the humidity. Also, you can use a humidity tray or place the pot on a tray filled with pebbles and water. The pot will be elevated above the water by sitting atop of the pebbles, and the evaporation will create a little humidity bubble for your orchid. For our orchids in small pots, we just sit the pots inside of old souffle dishes we've procured from various restaurants. It's the only reason I ordered a creme brulee, that way I can take home a souffle dish for my orchid. She likes fancy stuff. As for our potting mediums, use a well-draining orchid mix. And this usually consists of tree bark, perlite, and possibly some sphagnum moss. Actually, a note on sphagnum moss, you'll most certainly overwater your orchid if you water once a week and you have not yet removed the sphagnum moss from when you first bought it. I found that sphagnum moss can stay moist for nearly 2 weeks. Don't ask me how I found out, it doesn't make me very happy. I'm not going to let that happen to you because I'm your friend. If you're going to go with the sphagnum moss, or just let the sphagnum moss remain from when you bought your orchid, water it every 10 days. If your orchid is in a shaded area and has sphagnum moss, water it once every 2 weeks. Certain areas of the sphagnum moss will feel dry, but the core area where the roots hold on to the moss will likely still be moist, so be very careful if you're planning on using that particular medium. You shouldn't need to change your potting mix for at least a year or so. Besides, you don't want to have to disturb your orchids unless it's absolutely necessary. As far as pests, if you run into any pests, likely aphids or snails. You can use neem oil on the affected area to get rid of the aphids, and use something to deter the snails, such as magnesium sulfate or a product specifically formulated to deter snails. I have tried the method where you place a shallow dish filled with beer nearby to attract the snails to the beer. It actually worked, but unaliving the snails isn't exactly what I want to do, so I look more towards ways to send them off to other areas. I really wish they would just eat the crabgrass that keeps popping up every year. That would be super helpful. As for fertilization, you can use a balanced fertilizer that's specifically formulated for orchids. You'll want to fertilize your orchids every 2 weeks during their growing season. That's going to be usually spring and summer. And then only once a month, maybe, during the dormant periods, and that'll be your fall and winter. Orchids do well with a balanced fertilizer with a ratio of 20-20-20. I use the Miracle Grow Orchid Plant Food Spray. I don't know anybody from Miracle Grow. They're probably really cool people. I'm just letting you know exactly what I use for my results. So you're just one of my go-tos for fertilizers. Anyway, it is a 20-20-20 formulated for orchids, and it comes in a small spray bottle, so it's very easy to just give your orchids a little spritz of food, and then they'll thank you with vibrant, colorful blooms for weeks, and it's really easy to use. I like it. Now, I have seen things about cinnamon and banana water, which are often spoken about as natural remedies or supplements for orchids, but these methods are easier to consider if all the facts are disclosed. So with cinnamon, it does have antifungal properties that can help protect the orchid from fungal infections. So if your orchid has a damaged leaf or root, you can dust the area, very lightly with cinnamon to prevent any infections. You can put cinnamon in the soil to help control mold and mildew growth also. You could also just not overwater your plant, and there's no need for cinnamon in your soil. Also, too much cinnamon or frequent use of cinnamon can dry out your orchid's tissues and potentially inhibit root growth, and that's definitely not something we want to look forward to. As for the banana water, the banana peels are rich in potassium, phosphorus, and calcium, which are beneficial nutrients for most plants. The potassium actually helps with overall plant health and flowering and even disease resistance. And I see that they recommend to use the banana water method only once a month. On the other hand, there's not really much phosphorus in that banana water and likely no nitrogen. So we'll end up with a different issue later on down the road. And that's when the experts will differentiate our hobby versus their profession. So be careful about using any old remedy floating around on the internet. Also, you can end up with bacterial growth in your orchids or your potting medium. Banana water can ferment and grow bacteria after just a few days. So you don't want to water your orchids and risk drowning it in bacteria-infested banana water. If you are going to use banana water, it needs to be within 2 days after you crafted your concoction, and you want to use it sparingly, and it definitely should not be a replacement fertilizer. We want to use a balanced fertilizer, and there's no appropriate method to determine how much of which nutrients are in the banana water. So play it safe. Orchids are a little bit too pretty to experiment with. Now, specifically for us Floridians and our delightfully warm and humid climate, moth orchids can do very well here. However, we need to pay attention to some specific considerations for our orchids. For growing your orchids outdoors, you can put your moth orchids in shaded areas or a spot that receives sprinkles of sunlight, such as under a tree where the tree's leaves only allow for just a little bit of sunlight to reach the orchid. You want to keep in mind the rain. Well, we need humidity for our orchids, and Florida can have plenty of it, thanks to our rain, of course. The only bad part about the rain in Florida is that it can rain at your neighbor's house, but your house will remain dry and sunny just across the street. This really happens in Florida, a lot. Our frequent rainstorms can overwater the orchids, which will lead to root rot or even crown rot. So place them in areas where they're protected from heavy rain. If they're in pots, ensure the drainage is the absolute best you can get it. You don't want any excess water being retained around our orchids. Also, try to ensure your orchids are slightly angled, as this can help them get rid of excess water being held in the crown. Our orchids in Florida will have most of the year to have happiness and ideal conditions. However, when we get into the late winter season, January, February, you'll want to bring them indoors, or at least ensure that they're covered when we're expecting weather below 60 degrees. And of course, Florida has some of the most delicious humidity in the world. At least that's what the orchids were talking about on Twitter. Anyway, we want to ensure good air circulation around the orchids to prevent fungal issues. Areas that have a nice breeze through most of the day are great locations for your orchids. If you have them on a patio or in a sunroom, you'll want a fan to stay running just to keep the air moving around in the room. Also, when we hit our more humid times, you won't need to water as often, as the humidity is what the orchid is actually looking for. You'll want to water them once a week during the summer months when the air is a bit drier, but you'll want to mist them in between waterings. So we'll water them on Sunday and then mist them on Wednesday or Thursday, giving us a 3 to 4 day window before the next full watering. You'll want to monitor your particular environment to determine if your orchid is okay without water for 3 to 4 days. I would suggest at least misting 4 days after your last watering, just to be sure we aren't missing any moisture being retained elsewhere. Keep in mind, this is just for those very hot summer days, the ones where the snowbirds will be in town. Sometimes I wonder if they're the reason it gets so hot down here, but they do usually bring great gifts with them, so I guess it's a decent trade-off. And finally, our good old Florida sunshine. We're the #1 destination for fun in the sun, but our sunshine can become quite intense and will most certainly burn our orchids with too much exposure. Be extremely cautious of too much direct Florida sun on your orchids, as too much sun will burn the orchid's leaves, and we don't want that happening to our orchids. Let's go with an area with bright indirect sunlight, such as a shaded area on your patio or lanai, or just out of range of a nearby window in your sunroom. We can try morning sunlight, as the heat and sunlight isn't as intense early in the mornings and should only be for about 2 to 3 hours. If you have a spot to accommodate 1 to 2 hours, you'll have a very happy orchid. We also want to consider filtered sunlight, such as the scattered minimum amount of sunlight you'll see underneath the tree. Well, now that we know how to make our neighbors jealous with orchids, I think we should add a few more to the collection. It is floral warfare, and we're not here to play nice. Monitor your orchid's light exposure, humidity, and watering cycle, and you have got yourself a plant that will set you miles apart from your neighbors. Don't worry, the orchid can still taste their jealousy from miles away. Secure a couple in a tree with some gardening twine until it anchors itself to the bark, and then tell everyone you hadn't even noticed it was there. Put some in wooden hanging baskets or orchid pots so the neighbors can see those beautiful roots just reaching out from all angles. Or put a different orchid in each room of your house so people have to be reminded that you're better than them at growing orchids. It's okay, we don't always have to be modest. Besides, it's your house. Well, I hope you found this information helpful, and I hope you just happen to come home with a few more orchids on your next day off. Let's make sure the neighbors are jealous all year long. Until next time, Bao Chi Lian Nu.